The crystal caves of Zerion glowed with soft blue light. Deep inside these caves, Skyweaver watched over her 3 young ones. She was not like the dragons from old Earth stories. She was a Draconi, an ancient being who had lived for over 1,000 years. Her scales shimmered like starlight, and her eyes held the wisdom of ages. The 3 young Draconi slept peacefully near her massive form. Starfire had scales that looked like burning gold. Moonbeam's scales were silver and seemed to catch every bit of light. Thunderheart was the smallest, with deep purple scales that sparkled like tiny gems. They were not her own children, but she loved them as if they were. These 3 were the last young Draconi in the known galaxy. Skyweaver had found their eggs abandoned on dead worlds. She had taken them in and raised them for 50 years. In Draconi terms, they were still babies who could not yet fly or defend themselves. Outside the caves, the world of Zerion was dying. The Void Swarm had found them. These horrible creatures were like a disease that spread through space. They looked like twisted metal and flesh joined together. They fed on life itself, draining the energy from everything they touched. For 3 days, Skyweaver had fought them alone. She could create shields of pure energy that burned the void creatures. She could throw lightning from her claws and breathe fire hot enough to melt metal. But there were too many of them. They kept coming, wave after wave. The beautiful forests of Zerion were now gray and dead. The rivers had stopped flowing. Even the air felt thin and cold. The Void Swarm was eating the planet itself. Skyweaver felt tired for the first time in centuries. Her energy shields flickered and grew weak. The cave entrance had been sealed with rocks and her power, but she could hear the creatures outside. They scratched and clawed, trying to break through. Their horrible sounds echoed through the tunnels. She looked at the 3 sleeping young ones. They trusted her completely. They believed she could keep them safe from anything. But now, as another wave of void creatures slammed against her barriers, Skyweaver felt something she had never felt before: fear. The Draconi had always been proud. They solved their own problems. They did not ask for help from anyone. But as Skyweaver watched her barriers crack under another attack, she knew the truth. She could not save them alone. The creatures outside were getting stronger. She could feel them learning her patterns, finding weak spots in her defenses. Some of them had managed to slip into the outer tunnels. It would not be long before they reached this chamber. Starfire stirred in his sleep and made a small sound. Even sleeping, he seemed to sense danger. Moonbeam and Thunderheart moved closer together. They were so young, so innocent. They had never seen the galaxy outside these caves. They had never known the joy of flying through star fields or dancing on solar winds. Skyweaver made a decision that went against everything her people believed. She opened her mind and sent out a call across space. It was a desperate cry for help, broadcast to anyone who might hear it. She did not expect an answer. The galaxy was a big, empty place, and most species were too busy with their own problems. The call went out like ripples on a pond. It carried her fear, her love for the young ones, and her desperate need for help. Any creature with psychic ability might hear it. But would they care? Would they risk their lives for strangers, as she sent the call? More void creatures broke through her outer defenses. She could hear them in the tunnels now, getting closer. Their feeding sounds were horrible, like metal grinding against bone. They left nothing alive behind them. Skyweaver pulled her energy back to protect just this one chamber. The barriers around her and the young ones grew brighter, but smaller. She was buying time, but not much. Maybe a few more days at best. She thought about the young ones' short lives. Starfire loved to play with the crystal formations in the cave. He would stack them in tall towers and then knock them down with his tiny claws. Moonbeam was always curious about everything. She asked endless questions about the world outside. Thunderheart was gentle and quiet. He liked to curl up against Skyweaver's warm scales and listen to her stories. They deserved to see the galaxy. They deserved to grow up, to learn to fly, to find their own paths among the stars. But unless someone answered her call, they would die here in these caves, never knowing the beauty of the universe beyond. The scratching sounds got louder. Cracks appeared in the stone walls. The void creatures had found a weak spot and were working together to break through. Skyweaver could feel their hunger, their endless need to consume and destroy. She tried to make her barriers stronger, but she was running out of power. 1,000 years of life, and it might all end here. The proud Draconi race reduced to one tired guardian and 3 helpless young ones. The crystal formations around the chamber began to dim. The void creature's presence drained energy from everything nearby. Soon even the cave's natural light would die. Then it would be dark and the creatures would come. Skyweaver closed her eyes and sent out another call. This one was weaker than the first, but filled with more emotion. She poured all her love, for the young ones, into it, all her hope that someone somewhere might care enough to help. The sound of breaking stone filled the chamber. The void creatures had found their way into the tunnel system. Skyweaver could smell their awful stench, like rotting metal and death. She wrapped her great wings around the 3 young ones and prepared for the end. But somewhere in the darkness of space, her call had been heard. A small ship was changing course, heading towards Xerion. The crew had no idea what they were flying into, but they knew someone needed help, and sometimes that was enough. Lisa Carter was working the night shift on the UES frontier when the headaches started. She was the ship's communications officer, used to the usual chatter of space traffic and automated signals. But this was different. This felt like someone screaming inside her head. She pressed her hands to her temples and tried to focus. The bridge was quiet except for the soft hum of the engines. Most of the crew was asleep. Captain Jake Morrison was in his quarters, probably reading one of his old books. The frontier was on a routine survey mission, mapping new star systems for Earth Command. The pain got worse. Lisa saw flashes of images that made no sense. Crystal caves, something with golden scales, creatures made of twisted metal, and underneath it all, a feeling of desperate love and terrible fear. Lisa stumbled to her feet and hit the emergency button. Alarms rang through the ship and Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom. "What's the situation, Carter?" "Captain, I need you on the bridge. Something's wrong. I'm getting some kind of signal, but it's not through our equipment. It's in my head." Morrison arrived on the bridge within minutes, still pulling on his uniform jacket. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes. He had been exploring space for 20 years and had seen many strange things. Behind him came Dr. Amy Rodriguez, the science officer, and Sergeant Ben Davis, their security chief. Lisa was sitting at her station, pale and shaking. "Captain, there's someone out there calling for help. I can feel their fear. They're protecting something, and they're running out of time." Amy ran a quick medical scan with her portable device. Her brain activity is off the charts. She's definitely receiving some kind of signal, but I've never seen anything like this. Morrison made a decision that would change all their lives. "Carter, can you tell where it's coming from?" Lisa closed her eyes and concentrated. The pain was getting worse, but she could sense a direction. "It's about 3 days away at maximum speed. The signal is getting weaker." Ben Davis checked his weapons inventory. He was a practical man who believed in being prepared. "Captain, this could be a trap. We don't know what's out there." Morrison looked at the star charts on the main screen. The signal was coming from an unexplored system. Earth Command had no ships in that area. If someone needed help, the frontier was probably the only vessel close enough to respond. "Amy, what do you think?" Morrison asked his science officer. Dr. Rodriguez was already running calculations. "The energy readings from that system are enormous. Whatever's happening out there, it's big. And Carter's right about the signal getting weaker. If we're going to help, we need to go now." Morrison thought about his crew. There were 12 of them on the frontier. They were explorers, not soldiers. Their ship had basic defensive systems, but nothing that could handle a real battle. Still, someone was calling for help across the vast emptiness of space. "Set course for the signal's origin," Morrison ordered. "Maximum speed." Pilot Tony Kim, who had been listening from his station, started the navigation sequence. "Course set, Captain. 3 days to destination." As the frontier changed direction and sped up, Lisa felt the signal getting stronger. The images in her mind became clearer. She saw a massive creature with shimmering scales protecting 3 smaller ones. She saw monsters made of metal and flesh trying to break into crystal caves. "Captain," Lisa said, her voice shaking, "I think it's a mother trying to protect her children, and I think she's losing." Dr. Rodriguez set up her equipment to monitor Lisa's condition during the journey. Engineer Carlos Mendez made sure the engines could handle the extended high-speed travel. Medic Susan Wright prepared her supplies, knowing they might find injured survivors. During the 3-day journey, Lisa's connection to the signal grew stronger. She started having dreams about flying through starfields and dancing on solar winds. She saw memories of a civilization that was ancient when Earth was young. She felt the loneliness of being the last guardian of a dying race. The crew worked together to understand what they might face. Amy analyzed the energy readings and realized they were heading toward a massive battle. Carlos studied the ship's systems and figured out ways to boost their shields and weapons. Ben planned defensive strategies, even though he knew they were probably useless against whatever was out there. Morrison spent his time thinking about first contact protocols. If they were about to meet a new species, he wanted to do it right. But the more Lisa told them about what she was seeing, the more he realized this was not going to be a normal first contact situation. "She's been alone for so long," Lisa said on the second day. "She's taken care of children that aren't even her own because there's no one else left. And now she's dying, trying to protect them." Susan Wright, who had children of her own back on Earth, felt her heart break at the story. "We have to help them, Captain. I don't care how dangerous it is." Morrison looked around at his crew. They were scared but determined. They all understood that someone needed help, and they were the only ones who could provide it. On the 3rd day, they arrived at the Xerion system. What they saw shocked them all. The planet below was gray and dying. Huge ships that looked like twisted metal and flesh were swarming around it. Energy beams shot back and forth between the surface and the ships. "My God," Amy whispered. "Look at what they've done to that world." Lisa grabbed her head as the signal suddenly got much stronger. "She knows we're here. She can't believe we came. She's trying to warn us away." Morrison opened a communication channel even though he knew the creature might not understand. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earthship Frontier. We received your call for help. We're here to assist you." For a moment there was silence. Then Lisa straightened up, and when she spoke, her voice had a different quality to it. "You came. Across the void, knowing nothing of us, you came." "Why?" Morrison answered simply. "Because you asked for help and someone needed it." That's enough. Through Lisa's connection, they felt Skyweaver's amazement. In all her 1,000 years of life, she had never encountered beings who would risk themselves for strangers. The concept was completely alien to her proud race. "Your young ones," Morrison continued. "We're going to get them out of there." Ben Davis looked at the overwhelming enemy forces and shook his head. But he was already planning the impossible. Captain Morrison stared at the tactical display and tried not to show his fear. The Void Swarm had over 200 ships surrounding Xerion. Each one was 3 times the size of the Frontier. They looked like nightmares made real, with twisted metal hulls covered in what looked like living tissue. "Amy, what are we looking at?" Morrison asked his science officer. Dr. Rodriguez worked at her station, running every scan she could think of. "The ships are part organic, part machine. They're drawing energy from the planet itself. And Captain, they're also drawing energy from each other." Engineer Carlos Mendez looked up from his repair work. "What do you mean, drawing energy from each other?" Amy pulled up a detailed scan on the main screen. "Look at these energy patterns. The ships are connected somehow. They share power and information through some kind of network." Lisa Carter, still connected to Skyweaver through the psychic link, suddenly sat up straight. "She says they have a hive mind. All the ships think together. That's how they coordinate their attacks." Ben Davis, the security chief, studied the enemy formation. "A hive mind. That means if we could disrupt their connection, they might get confused." Carlos nodded, understanding where this was going. "Like cutting communication lines. If they can't talk to each other, they can't work together." Morrison felt a spark of hope. "Amy, is there a way to disrupt their connection?" Dr. Rodriguez was already running calculations. "Maybe. If we could generate a strong enough electromagnetic pulse, it might interfere with their network. But we'd have to get close to the center of their formation." Ben laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's suicide, Captain. We'd never make it through their defenses." Through Lisa, Skyweaver's voice reached them. "Your ship is too small and weak. They will destroy you before you get close. I will not have more deaths on my conscience." Morrison walked to the main viewport and looked down at the dying planet. Somewhere in those crystal caves, 3 young creatures were waiting for help that might never come. Their guardian was exhausted and failing. Without help, they would all be dead within hours. "What if we don't go through their defenses?" Morrison said suddenly. "What if we go around them?" Tony Kim, their pilot, looked up from his navigation charts. Captain, there is no around. They've got the whole planet surrounded. Morrison smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. Not around the planet, Tony. Around their attention. We make them look somewhere else. Lisa felt Skyweaver's confusion through their connection. The ancient dragon could not understand human thinking. Here's what we're going to do, Morrison said, gathering his crew around the tactical display. Amy, you said the ships draw energy from the planet. What if Skyweaver could make them think she was escaping with her young ones? Dr. Rodriguez caught on immediately. The ships would follow her, thinking they could capture the young Draconi in open space where they're more vulnerable. Exactly. But it would just be an illusion. Skyweaver stays hidden while we go in and get the real young ones out. Carlos studied the cave system maps that Amy had compiled from their scans. Captain, those caves go deep, and they're crawling with smaller void creatures. We'd have to go in on foot. Ben was already planning the mission. Small team. Light weapons. In and out as fast as possible. Skyweaver's voice came through Lisa again. You do not understand. My illusions require enormous energy. I am already weak from days of fighting. Creating a false image of myself and the young ones might kill me. Morrison spoke directly to the communication link. If you don't try, you'll die anyway. And so will they. There was silence for a long moment. Then Skyweaver spoke again, and her voice was filled with something she had never felt before. Wonder. You would risk your lives for children who are not even your species. You would sacrifice yourselves for beings you have never seen. Susan Wright, the medic, spoke up. They're children. That's all we need to know. Through Lisa, they felt Skyweaver's emotions. The ancient dragon was struggling to understand these strange creatures who put others before themselves. In Draconi culture, such behavior was unthinkable. Morrison outlined the full plan. Skyweaver would create her illusion and lead most of the Void Swarm away from the planet. Meanwhile, a small team from the frontier would land near the caves and extract the young ones. The remaining crew would prepare the ship's reactor for overload, creating an electromagnetic pulse that would disrupt the Void network when the ships returned. It's still a suicide mission, Ben pointed out. Even if everything goes perfectly, we might not be able to get back to the ship before the reactor overloads. Carlos had been working on that problem. I might be able to rig a delayed trigger. Give us maybe 30 minutes to get clear. Tony studied the planetary surface maps. There's a thermal vent system that connects to the caves. If we go in through there, we might avoid most of the surface patrols. Lisa suddenly grabbed her head as another wave of images hit her. The young ones. I can see them now. They're beautiful, and they're so scared. Through the psychic link, Skyweaver shared her memories of the 3 young Draconi. Starfire, with his playful nature and golden scales. Moonbeam, curious about everything and eager to explore. Thunderheart, gentle and quiet, who loved to listen to stories. They're not just children, Lisa whispered. They're the last hope of their entire species. Morrison made his decision. We're doing this. Ben, pick your team. Carlos, start rigging that overload system. Amy, I need detailed scans of those caves. As the crew prepared for what might be their final mission, Skyweaver spoke through Lisa one more time. Why, I must understand. What drives you to risk everything for strangers? Morrison thought about his answer carefully. Because it's the right thing to do. Because they need help and we can give it. Because if we don't try, who will? Your species is very strange, Skyweaver said. And perhaps that strangeness might save us all. The plan was insane. The odds were terrible. But as Morrison looked around at his crew, he saw determination in every face. They were scared, but they were ready. In a few hours, they would find out if human stubbornness and alien wisdom could work together to save the last young dragons in the galaxy. The thermal vents on Zerion's surface were hot enough to melt metal, but they were the only way to reach the caves without being detected. Captain Morrison checked his environmental suit one more time as he prepared to lead the rescue team into hell. Ben Davis carried the heaviest weapons, even though they probably would not work well against the void creatures. Susan Wright had her medical supplies and emergency equipment. Lisa Carter was their link to Skyweaver, though the psychic connection was getting harder to maintain as they got farther from the ship. Above them, the plan was already in motion. Skyweaver had created the most powerful illusion of her 1,000-year life. To the Void Swarm, it looked like she was fleeing the planet with her 3 young ones. The image was perfect, showing her massive form carrying the smaller dragons through space toward the outer planets. The trick worked. Over half of the void ships broke off their attack on the caves and gave chase to the false image. But that still left nearly 100 ships in orbit, and thousands of smaller creatures on the planet's surface. Tony Kim's voice crackled through their communicators. "Ground team, you have maybe 4 hours before the illusion fails. Skyweaver is pouring everything she has into it." Morrison led his team down into the thermal vents. The heat was incredible, even with their environmental suits. The rock walls glowed red-hot and steam hissed from cracks in the stone. But Carlos Mendez had been right. The vents connected to the cave system, and they were too hot for most of the void creatures. "Movement ahead," Ben warned, raising his weapon. Through the steam, they could see shapes moving in the tunnels. These void creatures were different from the ones in space. They had adapted to the underground environment, becoming smaller and faster. Their metallic shells could withstand the heat, and their feeding tentacles were longer and more flexible. "Stay together," Morrison ordered. "We go around them if we can, through them if we have to." The first creature they encountered was the size of a large dog, with too many legs and eyes that glowed like red stars. It sensed their life energy and came at them fast. Ben's weapon burned through its shell, but 2 more creatures appeared from side tunnels. Susan Wright surprised everyone by pulling out a device she had built from spare parts. It generated a high-frequency sound that seemed to confuse the creatures. They stopped their attack and backed away, shaking their heads as if in pain. "Sonic disruptor," Susan explained as they ran past the confused creatures. "I thought it might interfere with their nervous systems." They made good time through the tunnels, avoiding most of the creatures by using Susan's device and staying to paths that were too hot for extended contact. But they could hear sounds of fighting echoing from deeper in the cave system. Skyweaver was still battling creatures that had broken through her defenses. Lisa suddenly stumbled, grabbing her head. "The connection is getting weak. Skyweaver is using too much energy for the illusion. I can barely sense the young ones anymore." Morrison helped her up. "How much farther?" Ben checked their position against the maps Amy had provided. 2 more levels down, then a long tunnel to the main chamber. They pressed on, but the creatures were getting more aggressive. The sonic disruptor was losing its effectiveness as the void creatures adapted to the sound. They had to fight their way through groups of the monsters, using precious ammunition and energy. In the main chamber far below, Skyweaver felt her strength failing. The illusion in space was taking everything she had, and she still had to maintain barriers against the creatures trying to break into her sanctuary. The 3 young ones huddled against her side, sensing her weakness. "Guardian," Starfire whispered with his young voice, "are the strange creatures really coming to help us?" Skyweaver looked down at the golden-scaled youngling. Through her fading connection with Lisa, she could sense the human team fighting their way through the tunnels. They were risking their lives for children they had never seen. "Yes, little flame, they are coming. And they are braver than any creatures I have known." Moonbeam, with her silver scales catching the crystal light, asked the question that had been troubling them all. "Why would they help us?" "We are not their kind." Skyweaver had wondered the same thing. In all her years, she had never encountered beings who would sacrifice themselves for strangers. "Because, Little Moon, some creatures have hearts larger than their own lives." Thunderheart, the smallest and quietest, pressed closer to her warm scales. "Will they be our friends?" "I believe they already are, Little Storm." The sound of weapons fire echoed through the tunnels. The human team was getting closer, but so were more void creatures. Skyweaver felt her barriers weaken as another wave of monsters threw themselves against her defenses. Morrison's team reached the final tunnel to the main chamber, just as Susan's sonic disruptor finally failed. The device sparked and went dead, leaving them to face a tunnel full of hungry void creatures with only their weapons and determination. "This is it," Ben said, checking his ammunition. "Whatever happens, we get those kids out." They fought their way down the tunnel, step by step. Ben took point, his heavy weapons clearing the path. Morrison and Lisa stayed in the middle, protecting their psychic link to Skyweaver. Susan brought up the rear, using her medical training to keep them all functional despite injuries and exhaustion. The creatures seemed to sense that the humans were close to their goal. They attacked with desperate fury, throwing themselves at the small team in waves, the tunnel filled with the sound of weapons fire and the horrible screeches of dying monsters. Finally, they broke through into the main chamber. What they saw took their breath away. Skyweaver was magnificent even in her exhaustion. Her scales, each one the size of a dinner plate, reflected the crystal light in patterns of incredible beauty. She was easily 50 feet long, with wings that could span twice that. Her eyes held intelligence and wisdom that made them feel small and young. But it was the three young ones that captured their hearts. They were the size of large horses, with scales that seemed to hold their own inner light. Despite their fear, they looked at the humans with curiosity and hope. "You came," Skyweaver said, and her mental voice was full of wonder. "You actually came." Morrison stepped forward, removing his helmet so she could see his face. "We said we would. Now let's get your children out of here." But even as he spoke, the sounds of breaking stone echoed through the chamber. The void creatures had found another way in. Time was running out, and the hardest part of their mission was just beginning. The crystal chamber shook as more void creatures broke through the walls. Captain Morrison looked at the three young Draconi and knew they had minutes, not hours, before the monsters reached them. Starfire, Moonbeam, and Thunderheart pressed against Skyweaver's massive form, their eyes wide with fear and wonder at the strange aliens who had come to save them. "Can they travel through the thermal vents?" Morrison asked Skyweaver. The ancient dragon's mental voice was weak but determined. "Their scales will protect them from the heat, but they cannot fly yet, and they have never been outside these caves." Susan Wright knelt down beside Thunderheart, the smallest of the three. His purple scales were beautiful, but she could see the fear in his ancient eyes. "It's okay, little one. We're going to get you somewhere safe." Thunderheart looked at Susan with curiosity. He had never seen anything like these small, soft creatures before, but something in Susan's voice calmed him. He stepped closer to her, and she gently touched his snout. Ben Davis was setting up defensive positions at the chamber entrances. "Captain, we've got multiple breaches. They'll be through in minutes." Morrison made a decision that went against every tactical manual he had ever read. "Ben, you take point. Get these young ones to the surface. Susan, stay with them. Lisa, maintain the link with Skyweaver as long as you can." "What about you, Captain?" Lisa asked, though she already knew the answer. Morrison looked at Skyweaver, who was barely maintaining her barriers against the void creatures. "Someone needs to help hold them off until you get clear." Ben Davis had trained for situations like this his whole life. He knew what Morrison was asking him to do. "Sir, I should be the one to stay. You're needed to command the evacuation." "That's an order, Sergeant. Get those kids out of here." Skyweaver watched this exchange with amazement. These creatures were arguing about who would sacrifice themselves for others. In her 1,000 years of life, she had never seen such behavior. The first void creatures broke through into the chamber. They were the large ones, as big as the young Draconi, but made of twisted metal and flesh. Their feeding tentacles reached out, trying to drain life energy from everything in the chamber. Morrison opened fire with his weapon, while Skyweaver threw bolts of energy at the monsters. But there were too many of them. For every one they destroyed, 3 more took its place. "Go," Morrison shouted to Ben. "Now!" Ben led the evacuation team toward the thermal vents, with the 3 young Draconi following close behind. Starfire looked back at Morrison and Skyweaver, understanding that they might not see them again. The journey through the superheated tunnels was a nightmare. The young Draconi had never been in such tight spaces, and the heat made it hard to breathe even with their natural protections. Susan Wright stayed with Thunderheart, encouraging him when he wanted to stop. Ben guided Starfire and Moonbeam through the most dangerous passages. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of battle growing fainter. Morrison and Skyweaver were buying them time with their lives. In the crystal chamber, Morrison was down to his last power cell. The void creatures kept coming, drawn by the life energy in the room. Skyweaver was magnificent in her final battle, breathing fire that melted the monsters' metal shells and creating energy shields that held back waves of attackers. "Your species," Skyweaver said, as she incinerated another group of creatures, "is remarkable. You risk everything for others, even when it gains you nothing." Morrison reloaded his weapon and kept firing. "That's what makes us human, I guess. We're too stubborn to give up when someone needs help. I understand now why the young ones bonded with your people so quickly. You have something my race lost long ago. Hope." The chamber walls cracked under the assault of hundreds of creatures. Morrison's weapon finally died, its power cell completely drained. Skyweaver's barriers flickered and failed. The void swarm surged forward. But at that moment, Carlos Mendez's voice came over Morrison's communicator. Captain, EMP detonation in 30 seconds. Everyone needs to be clear of the blast zone. Morrison smiled. His crew had made it to the ship. The young ones were safe. High above the planet, the Frontier's reactor reached critical overload. The electromagnetic pulse that erupted from the ship was visible from space, a wave of pure energy that washed over the Void Swarm fleet. The effect was immediate and devastating. The hive mind connection that linked all the creatures was severed in an instant. Ships that had been working together suddenly turned on each other, their confused organic components attacking anything that moved. The creatures in the cave stopped their coordinated assault and began fighting among themselves. In the confusion, Ben's team made it to the surface with the 3 young Draconi. Tony Kim was waiting with a shuttle, having somehow managed to survive the EMP blast by shielding the small craft behind a rocky outcrop. "Where's the captain?" Tony asked as they loaded the young ones into the shuttle. Ben's face was grim. "He stayed behind to buy us time." But as they lifted off from the planet's surface, sensors detected 2 life signs moving through the cave system. Somehow, Morrison and Skyweaver had survived the void creature attack and were making their way toward the surface. The EMP had done more than disrupt the void swarm. It had revealed something that Skyweaver had never noticed before. The creatures had been feeding through nodes buried deep in the planet's crust. With her enhanced senses no longer overwhelmed by the hive mind's presence, she could see the feeding network clearly. Working together, Morrison and Skyweaver destroyed the ground-based nodes. Without their connection to the planet's life force, the remaining void creatures began to weaken and retreat. When the Frontier's crew was finally reunited, they found that the 3 young Draconi had bonded with their rescuers in a way that surprised everyone. Starfire followed Ben Davis around like a puppy, fascinated by the soldiers' equipment. Moonbeam peppered Amy Rodriguez with questions about the ship and the stars beyond. Thunderheart stayed close to Susan Wright, who had become his adopted human mother. Skyweaver looked at her rescued young ones playing with their human friends and felt something she had never experienced before. She was not alone anymore. These strange, brave creatures had not only saved her children, but had given her a new family. "Captain Morrison," she said, as the Frontier prepared to leave the Zerian system, "my people have a saying. The greatest strength is found in the smallest acts of kindness. Your species has taught an old dragon that wisdom comes in many forms." Morrison smiled as he watched Lisa Carter teaching Moonbeam how to play human card games. "I think we've all learned something today. Sometimes the best friendships come from the most unlikely meetings." As the Frontier set course for Earth, carrying news of humanity's first dragon allies, Skyweaver made a decision that would change both their species forever. She would share the locations of other surviving Draconi with Earth Command, beginning an alliance that would span the galaxy. The 3 young Draconi would grow up as ambassadors between 2 very different species, carrying with them the lesson that family is not about blood or species, but about who stands beside you when the darkness comes calling. And in the halls of human space, the story of the Frontier's crew would become legend. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because when someone called for help across the void, they answered. Because sometimes that's all it takes to change the galaxy.